Hi all, this is the first of our online videos for CANA 1F91. This is our fifth treaty lecture for the course, and we've been going chronologically, moving from the 17th and 18th centuries on. Spent most of our time in the last 2 weeks in the 19th century, and now we're moving into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Interestingly too, this is the first time we actually have a Canadian treaty. And that's, of course, interesting because everything we've been looking at, well, we had one French negotiation, but everything we've been looking at has been a British treaty, a British negotiation. It's the British Empire ruling its territories. And so this is different. This is after 1867. It's Western, what's now Western Canada, wasn't at the time. Western Canada becomes Western Canada in the process of what we're talking about today. But it's Canadian politicians, Canadian officials negotiating all of this. And so it's a Canadian treaty. We're just as responsible for all the other treaties, the British ones, because we're the successor government to those British treaties. So the responsibility gets passed on to us. But these are the first ones that we, as a country, actually negotiated ourselves. So I'm calling this one "As Long as the Sun Walks and the Saskatchewan River Flows," the numbered treaties of the Canadian West. And that quote, "As long as the sun walks and the Saskatchewan River flows," it's a bit poetical, obviously, and it points to the idea that we've been seeing repeatedly from a number of indigenous negotiators and commentators on the treaties that emphasize that idea of longevity of the treaty, that the treaty is meant to be a long-standing relationship, and that kind of sense of permanence. Of course, as long as the sun walks and the Saskatchewan River flows, that's not ever going to stop, at least not within something imaginable in our lives. That's just not going to happen. So that's that sense of permanence. And I think it's also useful, too, because it reminds us to think about these things as the beginning of a process rather than the end of a process. I think an awful lot of people looking at the land surrender treaties view that as a final moment where the indigenous people are conquered and therefore give up their lands, and that's kind of the end of the story. As I've been emphasizing from the beginning of this, most treaties look forward to a future relationship. That's the nature of a treaty. It's about managing a relationship into the future. And these treaties are no different. And certainly indigenous people, when they talk about it, they emphasize that. We'll see that the British officials sometimes do and sometimes, this week the Canadians, sorry. You'll see sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It's just that they seem much more willing to kind of forget that dimension later than the indigenous people were. So this week we're going to look at a little bit more history this week than in past weeks. We're going to emphasize kind of the Canadian part of the story. It's very much a Canadian story and very much a part of the creation of Canada. We're going to look at the Red River Uprising in Red River, now Manitoba, in 1870. It's really results in the birth, if you will, of Manitoba, the creation of Manitoba. And of course, that too is part, of course, of the creation of Canada. But it's also part of this kind of broader story that I want to tell you about the West. And I want to kind of tie it into a kind of vision that Canadian politicians in the late 19th century had for Canada, which involved economic expansion and so on. And that's not directly related to the treaties, but it's very much the context within which they see their actions. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We'll talk about the conquest of the Plains Cree, and I've got conquest in quotation marks there because there's no real war. There's no real moment that we can call the conquest of the Plains Cree. What we will see is certainly a weakened people, but not necessarily a conquered people. And I think some people anyhow, like to talk about it as a conquest because that gets at that idea that we conquered them and therefore we took their land and that makes it legal and okay and so on, as we've seen in past weeks. But I want to suggest that, well, I don't have to suggest it, there was no war. There's no war we can actually talk about. So then we'll talk a little bit about the actual treaty making itself, and then we'll move on to the treaties in law today. I'll just look at one quick example there to show you some of those discussions. So I want to begin here with a map of Canada. This is Canada in 1867. It's Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. And as you can see from this map, it's only parts of modern-day Quebec and parts of modern-day Ontario. It's southern Quebec and southern and eastern Quebec, southern and eastern Quebec, and southern and western, I guess, Ontario, but not those northern parts. You can see they're labeled Rupert's Land there. But these are the colonies that the British colonies that come together in 1867 to form Canada. We don't really need to worry too much about that story, except to say that these colonies all had their own particular relationships with Indigenous people, but that in 1867, the new federal government of Canada takes over those responsibilities for the entire country. So here's North America, or Northern Canada, British North America at this point. So there's Canada, the 4 colonies that have joined together, now 4 provinces. And you can see out west, there's British Columbia, which will join shortly after 1867. But there's that huge, I don't know what color that is, pink purple bit in the middle, described as Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territories. That's a massive chunk of territory, and it's most of modern day Canada. So we need to talk about how that becomes part of Canada. We need to talk about how that becomes incorporated. And you'll also notice down there's a tiny little version of Manitoba. If you know anything about Manitoba, you'll know that it grows really quite considerably. Let's see if I can get my pen going here. I mean, modern day Manitoba is something like this. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's a ballpark estimate of what modern Manitoba looks like. You see, it's much smaller here, and that reflects a dimension of the story that I'll tell you here in a few minutes. But what we want to see is that territory, that big, huge Rupert's Land territory in the middle, that's the object that we're looking at today. That's the territory that is treated for, the treaties are written for, in the time period that we're looking at in this course. So you can see they begin roughly around Winnipeg, right around there, and they expand northward and westward from there, more or less as the Canadian government wants to get settlers in place, although, as we'll see, Indigenous people push that timetable along. I want to step back, though, and look at kind of the broader vision of the country here. I think we have a kind of sense of a natural sense of, just people expanding, immigrants coming in, taking up territory. And I want you to see that it's part of a kind of vision for the country. And I'm going to begin here with the national policy. That's 1879, which is slightly after the treaties that we're about to look at. So you might think, how did that influence something that happened in the past? That's kind of nonsense, right? But these ideas behind the national policy, they all come together in 1879, but they have been discussed for at least a decade at this point in time. Most significant of these, of course, is the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. You can see a dimension of that, this photograph here, this bridge under construction in British Columbia in 1880. The Canadian Pacific Railway is that massive railway built across the country in the 19th century and late 19th century. And it's really part of the kind of great mythology of the creation of the country, this belt across the country that binds it together. It's like an extended metaphor for keeping us all together. And of course, it really was very important. There's no doubt about that. It's a major transportation link. It connects all the colonies together and provinces together in some kind of fashion. It provides economic infrastructure and development, and of course, it's a major feat of the day. They're building a railway across a massive territory, including, as this photograph indicates, the Rocky Mountains. But the national policy has different dimensions, and so one of them is the railway, but we can also talk about the settlement of the West. And this, again, is part of the kind of vision that the Canadian politicians of the day, and I stress, this is beginning in the 1850s and 60s that they're talking about these things. They want this territory to be Canada's territory. In fact, it's spoken of as kind of Canada's empire. And there you can see Canadian politicians emulating the ideals of their British masters, if you will, the mother country of Britain. And as they are an empire, they conquer parts of Africa, they conquer parts of India, they conquer significant parts of the world. They're the biggest empire in the world in the 19th century. And so this is kind of many Canadian politicians and business people's idea that we too can colonize, we too can take over large swaths of territory, we too can tame savage peoples, as they would have said at the time. We can Christianize them, we can civilize them in that kind of 19th century language that was very popular and very common at the time. The third thing we can point to here is tariff protection. And this gets a little bit more complicated, and I don't want to get too bogged down here, but it's basically just an economic program where taxes are put on imports of key strategic goods coming into the country, most notably from the United States, as a way to protect Canadian industry. So here's kind of the plan in place. This map, this is an advertisement from late 19th century, shows the railway networks that's being established, shows the expanding country, kind of economic development. There's certainly a vision here of prosperity and so on. But settlement has to be part of that. You need to get people onto that territory. They want to build farms, they want to build cities. That railway has to do something, and that railway should be moving goods and people across the country. And that's kind of the whole idea, the whole purpose of the whole thing. And the industry angle is interesting because the idea here is that there'll be industry in the east, so coal mines, steel factories, cotton factories, sugar factories, things that are manufacturing industries. And they'll develop in the east, protected by the tariffs. And farming and agriculture will develop in the west. And that's the idea that the railway will take out people and bring back their agricultural products and then take out those industrial products. And so the idea is that there's a kind of a package here. The settlement, the tariffs, and the expansion into the west is all part of a package that links all this together. And that you can build a country that way. And we don't need to worry about this in this course because it's not our focus. We're just looking at the indigenous connection here. But I do want you to see that there's kind of a plan and a vision for the future here that's really very much structuring the story. There is this kind of imperial dimension here, and it's worthwhile thinking about that for a moment too, that Canada wants to take over this territory. But of course, there are obstacles to Canada taking over this territory. The biggest one, physically anyhow, is that they actually don't own the territory. Rupert's Land, this is a complex question of law and sovereignty, but the land is claimed by the British, and they certainly have a hold on it. And they've leased all that land, that huge land. Let me swap back here to this map for one quick second. Look at that territory. So take out my Manitoba lines. That big swath of territory in the middle, that big pink-purple section in the middle, that's all controlled by a private company, the Hudson's Bay Company. And Canada wants to take control of that territory. So the government puts pressure on the Hudson's Bay Company to sell that land to Canada. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other obstacles are the Métis at Red River, modern-day Winnipeg. The Métis people are mixed, indigenous, mostly French, but a lot of Scottish as well, people who have been at the Red River settlement at this point for about 100, 150 years. They're kind of byproducts rather of the fur trade. French and later Scottish fur traders go into the West. They form relationships, in part with women, but also in part with families, and they marry women to form these relationships with families as a way of kind of conducting themselves while they live in the West. And they live in the West often for long periods of time, years and decades often. And so they take on indigenous wives. Many of these people stay, and certainly their children often stay in the West. And by the time that we're looking at, the 1870s, they've come to form a significant part of the population. In fact, a large concentrated population in the area around Red River. They're there, and we'll see in a few minutes that they'll actually matter a lot. And then there's all the other First Nations people, all the other indigenous people around that territory throughout Rupert's Land. If we, as a country, are to form our empire in this territory, we need to deal with these issues. We need to acquire Rupert's Land. We need to form a relationship with the Métis people who already have an existing society at Red River, and we need to treat with those First Nations people, particularly on the issue of their land. So in making Manitoba, making a province there, Canada begins this process by purchasing Rupert's Land in 1869. And we don't need to talk about those details, but just simply know that we acquire it. These numbers are here, 300,000 pounds, which I translated there for you as 13 million pounds today. Pretty good deal for a huge chunk of territory if you think about it, but other charges as well. But we don't need to worry about that stuff. I just want you to get on to this point. What they do is they move in quickly, the British government officials, in particular their surveyors, move into this territory and begin kind of carving it up in these kinds of quadrant-like patterns that you see here on the right. This is kind of the layout of land, lots of land for settlers, that are anticipated to move into Manitoba and this territory. Except, as you can see here on this map on the left, people are already there, and they're not living on a kind of grid pattern. They're living according to the kind of natural geography of the land. They're building farms. You can see in this picture here, the Red River settlement 20 years earlier in the 1850s. They're building farms, settlements, churches, buildings. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a Hudson's Bay Company compound and fortress there. They see windmills, and there's an established society there. There's settlement there, but they're not carved up in square lots like the Dominion surveyors want them to be. They aligned their farms along the rivers and hills of southern Manitoba. So quickly then, who are the Métis? I mentioned this really, really briefly, but they're the offspring and ancestors of mixed marriages between French and Scottish fur traders in this time period. And this is probably the more important point for us right now. They're kind of a mixed economic people as well. They're certainly farmers, and they certainly do engage in farming, and that painting just 2 slides earlier showed you that. They're also buffalo hunters, and that's really kind of reflects their longer standing place in that society. That's why they're there. They were there as Hudson's Bay Company fur traders. And notice my little footnote here. I asked the question, who were the Métis? Of course, they still are a people. I'm just talking about who they were at the time, who the Canadian government was encountering at the time. They're led by this guy, Louis Riel, who forms a national committee of Métis peoples to oppose the imposed government sent in by Canada in 1869, led by this guy, William McDougall. We don't need to get into the stories of all of this, but I'll make the point quickly that they form a provisional government. They call it the government of Assiniboia. They want to call their place Assiniboia. It's made up largely of Métis people, although there are some non-Métis people involved in the provisional government. And they effectively just stop the development of Canada. They block, particularly the surveyors, but other government officials, including the governor, they block them from coming into the territory. And they say, you need to deal with us. You need to acknowledge us. You need to acknowledge that we're here, that we live in this territory, that we have land rights, that we own property, and that we're the dominant population here. We're French, we're Catholic, and we want those cultural rights to be respected here. It's a long story. We don't need to get into the details of all this. Please don't take notes on this stuff. I'm just kind of running over this, but kind of story to show you that something important is happening here in the background. They set out negotiations for the terms of entry of what they imagine to be Assiniboia. They want full provincial status. They want to be just like Nova Scotia or Ontario or whatever. They want an elected legislature, again, like the other colonies. They want control over land, like the other colonies. And having just committed treason in this rebel action, they want amnesty for the rebels. They don't want the Canadians, when this is all over, to then arrest all these people. They are, in fact, the community leaders of Red River. It's a long story. We don't need to get into the details of all of this, but I'll say really, really quickly that they achieve their ends a bit surprisingly because they're not particularly well organized. They don't have a military, but of course neither does Canada, and they also don't have a completed railway to the west. So they can't send troops out there. And Canada doesn't even really have an army at this point anyhow. But so Canada, I don't know what the exact right verb to use is, but they certainly relent, and they accept some of the terms, and they agree to form a province. And they call it Manitoba, and it's created the following year in 1870. It's officially bilingual. It has 2 school systems, and this is what protecting French and Catholic interests in the province. Their land and property are protected, but it's made very, very small, and the federal government take over control of land and resources outside that area. I'm just blew past a slide there because I don't want to get into that story. So, so here we are in 1870. Manitoba has been created. It's tiny, as you can see. It'll grow. It'll become significantly bigger. But now Canada has acquired all that territory and has a province there in the middle of it and a base from which to start developing Western Canada. We're going to build the railway. We're going to get settlers into that territory and move the country forward in that kind of manner. So what's happening with Indigenous people at this point? Well, the key factor here is the story of the collapse of the buffalo. This is an ecological disaster for the buffalo, obviously. But it's also an environmental, social, political, and economic disaster for the indigenous people of the prairies. The buffalo is the primary source of food. They eat buffalo meat, and also a prime source of shelter in the form of clothing. They make a lot of their clothing from buffalo robes, and even in terms of housing, a lot of their, when they build teepees, they often use the buffalo hides for the exteriors of the teepees. So it's a really important part of their material culture. It's also part of their culture. They view the buffalo as a spiritual animal, and they see it as a kind of dominant spiritual force in the world in which they inhabit. It's a long, complicated story that we don't really have time to tell here, but what we can say is that in the period beginning really around 1850, it had begun certainly earlier, but the really intense period is between 1850 and 1870. You see an incredible increase in the destruction and the hunting. And as this poster here from 1875 says, the wanton destruction of the buffalo in North America. Now, this is predominantly a United States story, although certainly it's partly happening in Canada as well. The buffalo are hunted for fur purposes, as they had been for hundreds of years. They're hunted in some terms for industrial purposes. Their hides are very good hides to be used for conveyor belts, for example, in industrial production. And of course, this is the beginning of the industrial era. So that kind of importance is really quite significant at the time. But there's also this kind of other dimension of it where for leisure purposes, for entertainment purposes, people are just shooting buffalo. And you can see in this, it's slightly apocryphal. It's not really that big a tale in many, many ways. But it does exemplify kind of this moment when bison or buffalo were being slaughtered across the country. And you can see there in that picture in the center, a trainload of people going by with just people with guns just shooting buffalo as they go by. It had become this kind of sport activity. The key feature is it has a devastating effect on the population. It's estimated that in early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, the bison population of North America was estimated at around 30 million animals. By 1885, so just shortly after what we're looking at, the numbers were down to a few hundred. In fact, there's an estimate that it might have been as low as 325, 350. Here you can see on this chart it says 550 as a low figure, but it's whatever it is, it's low. It's a much, much smaller number than it had been in the past. So that's a devastating blow to Indigenous people on the North American continent. And again, this map makes clear that this is not just a Canadian problem. This is the entire plains of North America, from northern Saskatchewan and Alberta, all the way down into northern Mexico. So much of the North American Western economy was affected by this. And certainly the Indigenous people who relied on that buffalo population for so much are devastated by what's happening there. Indigenous people in this territory are also hurt by influx of diseases, particularly Western diseases that they had not encountered before. There are smallpox outbreaks on the prairies in the 1860s and 70s, and you see large destruction of populations. Some bands in the northern plains of the United States and southern plains of Canada see populations cut down by as much as 75%. So here, as we're talking about, COVID-19 around us here in the course as we go along in this course, this is a disease outbreak with much more devastating consequences. Although perhaps they're a lesson on the potential for unchecked disease to run amongst populations and what kind of damage it can do. What we should note here is that these are connected matters. That the introduction of disease was devastating, no doubt about it, but it was made more devastating by the fact that the populations are being hurt by the fact that the buffalo population is declining. So they have less access to food, their people are generally less healthy because they're getting less food, in many cases actually malnourished, and that means that these diseases will have much greater impacts on their bodies. It's as simple as that. It's difficult to maintain immunity when you're not eating well. So the bottom line is that this is a devastating moment. If you look at that period, roughly 1860 to 1880, the plains people of North America are in a very bad position. They've been weakened because of disease. They've been weakened because the primary source of their food and their subsistence on the plains has been destroyed in this time period. So we've got negotiations coming for this land. And I'll quickly take you through two sides in those negotiations, the government and the indigenous people, and two sets of objectives. First, let's look at the government. Their objectives are pretty straightforward. They want to grab a hold of this territory for settlement purposes, and they're really wanting to fulfill what they see as their national and imperial objectives or aspirations, however you might want to term those. Indigenous people are looking for sustainability. They're looking for protection. They're looking for ways and means of protecting the buffalo populations of the prairies. That's not going to happen, but that's certainly one thing that many of the Plains people are looking for. They're recognizing that the world is changing around them, and most of them acknowledge that they need agricultural land and they need training for agriculture. These are not people who have engaged in agriculture before. They will need training to do so. So really what they're looking for is some kind of security, some kind of sustainable future. We can also, however, talk about different strategies amongst the indigenous people. Really quick, two quick examples here. One of whom is Crowfoot, who's a Blackfoot leader, signs the Treaty 7 agreement in 1877. Crowfoot's strategy in most of the negotiations was to sign quickly, to put pressure on the government to negotiate, and then to try to sign fairly quickly, to try to get support for his people as quickly as possible. So he's looking around his situation, his people's situation, and saying, we need help now, and sees a quick signing as possible. What seems to happen in many, many ways is that he did not perhaps get the best deal he could have for his people. There's other negotiators as well. It's not just him, but simplifying a bit here. But they probably could have gotten a better deal had they held out longer. But they certainly saw immediate support as more important. So they signed fairly quickly, put pressure and signed fairly quickly. Big Bear is putting pressure to sign as well, putting treaty pressure on the government as well to sign. But he is really determined to strike a better deal. He's also determined to try to keep as many indigenous people together, working together, as possible. He spends about 6 years organizing people throughout southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, and particularly in the Cypress Hills area, and trying to force negotiations there which would enable indigenous people to continue to hunt buffalo. And the reason he focuses on the Cypress Hills is that there is then an existing buffalo population there, and he sees this as something that they can continue to work with. The other thing he does is he tries to use a feature of the negotiating strategy of the Canadians to his advantage. The Canadian government says to all those bands that they can choose the locations where they'll build their reserves. And Big Bear, with his allies like Piapo here, they choose sites that are adjoining one another. They're contiguous borders. And so they're really trying to get all the reserves packed into one spot. And really what Big Bear has in mind here is establishing a kind of Indian territory, a larger Indian territory. So rather than being broken up in small reserves across the prairies, what Big Bear is trying to do is form a strategy that would enable them to inhabit a larger territory. The Canadian government, when they recognize what he's doing, put a stop to this very quickly and refused to continue to negotiate on that kind of basis. They really want these reserves in separate places. They know that if the indigenous people are split up into small chunks of land across the prairies, that they'll have very little capacity to mobilize to resist in any kind of military kind of fashion. So that doesn't last particularly long. The result is, though, that in holding off for that period of time, Big Bear's people became weaker and weaker. The buffalo population is continuing to decline. They're being hit with more diseases again. And by 1884, 1885, the Cree, who continued to follow Big Bear, were in a very weak position. So weak, in fact, that the federal government is clearly using the fact that they are starving as a tactic. And you can see in this quote from MacDonald, here he is in the House of Commons in 1881, talking about the fact that it might cost a lot of money to feed these Indians, as he says, and we can't let them starve. But he's perfectly willing to use that as a strategy to compel them to come to the table. What becomes very clear is that the negotiators are saying to Big Bear's Cree by 1884, 1885, we will support your people. We will give them rations. We will give them food and teach them how to farm for the future. But you must sign. And so that's really using the fact that they're in a desperate situation, that they're literally starving, as a way to bring them to the table to negotiate. So let's turn quickly, look at one actual treaty here. This is Treaty 6, signed in 1876. You can see it on the map here. It's basically central Saskatchewan and central Alberta. It's a huge swath of territory. 313,000 square kilometers, massive territory. A big chunk of the central prairies of Canada. We've been talking a lot in this course about what we know about these treaties. And of course, what we know best is what's in the treaty itself, what the treaty actually says. And I've been encouraging us to think beyond the immediate treaty, to look at the context of the treaty. And in particular, look for ways of understanding what Indigenous people wanted in the treaty, what they intended to derive from the treaty, and what they thought they were getting from the treaty that they were actually agreeing to. So we've seen a couple of instances where we know something of that. We looked at that, for example, in Rice Lake 2 weeks ago. We saw that document that showed us fairly clearly the negotiating position of the Rice Lake Indigenous peoples. And you can see there that they are expecting more. They're certainly asking for more in the negotiations than they end up with in the final treaty. And we saw that again this past week in the Huron-Robinson treaties as well. So we can see moments where they explain things, where they talk about things, and they show fairly clearly that what's in the treaty doesn't seem to represent what they were talking about at the time. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a concerted effort to try to put together some oral histories of Indigenous people to try to figure out how the communities together, not just individuals, but together, how these communities remembered the treaties. And obviously they wouldn't remember them directly. These are the ancestors of people who negotiated them. But how they were recorded orally in these communities and how they talked about them, and therefore how they understood them at the time. So I'm going to take you through just one of those. There are dozens of these done, but this is just one of them. And you can't tell the whole story from just this one, but you can see across a whole pile of these stories elements that are common, and you can kind of piece it together in that kind of fashion. So this guy's name is Fred Horse. He's interviewed in 1974, so this is almost a century later, so it's not his memory. It's probably him remembering what his grandfather told him as a young man. So I just want to take you through it's a long interview. It takes place over about an hour. Lots of stories here, but just a couple of points that we can see here. He says they told him, Morris, the federal government negotiator, the Crown negotiator, that first they would like to foresee the whole thing as they were depending on it. And by that I take it to mean that they're imagining kind of the whole terms of the treaty and how it would affect them into the future. And the future is also part of the next sentence. He says that the agreement would never come to an end as long as the earth existed. And that's a theme that we've seen in lots of treaties that we've been looking at throughout this course. The second thing that Fred Horse talks about is he says, these promises were made with the smoking of the pipe. If one put a pipe stem to his lips, that was a highly honored agreement, and Morris did that. So what he's saying there is that this is the Indigenous ceremony. They smoke this pipe as a ceremonial moment in the negotiations, and it speaks to an agreement, it speaks to fellowship, it speaks to that we are operating together in concert here. And we've seen other indications of this sort of thing in other treaties throughout the course. We certainly saw that with the early wampum agreements, for example. That these are symbolic gestures that are meant to show trust and fellowship and brotherhood in these relationships. We are now moving forward together is the signal that is sent by this. Now, it's not entirely clear that Morris fully understood that, fully understood exactly what that meant. But as we'll see in a minute, he certainly understood the basics. Last thing I want to point to is from Fred Horst's account. He talks about this fear that they have that maybe in the future that they might face dire conditions, and he was right about that. They certainly did. And the response that they remember in the community from Morris is that Morris says, "The Queen's arm is long, and when you are faced with starvation, she will reach out to protect you, as long as the sun walks and as long as the Saskatchewan River flows." And again, that's the line that I used in the title of the essay. But that's that notion that she will continue, she, the Queen, will continue to protect you. And of course, the Queen has nothing to do with this. She has no idea this is even going on. But she is the symbolic figurehead of the British government, still the symbolic figurehead of Canada, still is today. Well, not the same Queen, but the monarch is the same monarch of Canada on all our money. That the Queen will continue to provide support for those people well into the future, as long as we can possibly imagine into the future. So what I want you to see there is that there's a kind of set of ideas that they remember, things, principles that they remember from the negotiations. These are discussed in the community. We also, for this treaty, have some written accounts, and Morris himself kept some notes, and one of his assistants took some notes as well. And from those, we can see how they describe what's going on here. So I'll just take you through some of their account of Treaty Number 6. From Morris's report, he writes, "I had ascertained that the Indian mind was oppressed with vague fears. I accordingly shaped my address so as to give them confidence in the intentions of the government. I then fully explained to them that we did not wish to interfere with their present mode of living, but would assist them in commencing to farm." This is a weird statement, weird in all kinds of ways, but most weird in the sense that he's saying, on the one hand, we do not wish to interfere with your present mode of living, which is primarily hunting, right? But we will also assist them in commencing to farm. I think if I were an Indigenous person at the time, I would see more the present mode of living than the assist them in commencing to farm. I think I would have found reassurance there rather than a government that wants me to change my ways. And in fact, he says very, very clearly that we did not wish to interfere. They do want to interfere. That's absolutely clear. The residential school system is already in place at this point in time. It's about to expand dramatically. They very much want to interfere in these people's lives. They very much want to change how they look after themselves and care for themselves. The other thing we can take from Morris's account is he reports that they, the Cree leaders, then performed the dance of the pipe stem. And recall, the Indigenous memory also has this story. And the pipe was presented to us and stroked by our hands. The Indians then sat down, satisfied that in accordance with their custom, we had accepted the friendship of the Cree Nation. Well, yeah, that's exactly what that ceremony was about. And it's interesting because Morris here is clearly indicating that he understands that. I said earlier, he may not understand the full implications of it, but he understands the basics. He understands that the ceremony is meant to symbolize an agreement. It's meant to say that we are in accord on these points. We've reached an agreement here. So there really is a message that's being sent here that's pretty clear, pretty straightforward, and Morris seems to get it. At least he says he does. Again, one last thing from Morris. Again, he emphasizes this point about not wanting to interfere with your hunting and fishing. I want you to pursue it throughout the country. And we're going to talk about a legal case here in a minute. And remember that sentence when we get to that legal case. But I would like your children to be able to find food for themselves and their children that come after them. Now there, he probably means agriculture. But the fact that he is just the sentence before saying, you can continue. He also points to promising a school on the reserve. And we haven't really got to full-scale residential schools yet. Certainly not the expansion of them yet. But that's an important promise. It means that the kids in the reserve wouldn't have to travel far to go to the school. when they build residential schools, that's the whole point of the residential schools, is to get the kids off the reserves, is to get the kids away from their parents. They view the parents as a pernicious, dangerous influence on the children, because the parents will continue to encourage indigenous culture, whereas of course what they want to do is Christianize them, civilize them, and so on, to bring them into white culture. So the school on the reserve was certainly an important consideration for the Cree people. There's also promise for agricultural implements and training. That is in some ways fulfilled, in some ways not. In a different context, we could talk about that. They're promised some clothing, they're promised guns, they're promised an annuity of $1,000 a year for each band, though only for 3 years. And think of that in contrast to what was negotiated in Northern Ontario. And there's also a promise for a medicine chest. This is one of the few treaty items over the years that's been honored in a generous fashion, although even there with some problems. One of my colleagues in the history department, Maureen Lux, has written on this topic. And what's happened generally is that the federal government has actually built hospitals specifically for Indigenous people. But the issue of whether they're good hospitals or not, and the kind of treatment they received in those hospitals, is another matter altogether. And that's really the focus of Dr. Lux's work. And it's really good and impressive work. But certainly there was some efforts, however, made towards helping Indigenous people there. So I want you to see that kind of general account of a rough approximation, that the oral accounts and the written accounts seem to remember similar things, except that an awful lot of things that do actually show up in the treaty seem to be minimized in a way, rather than allowed to be working towards Indigenous people's advantages. It seems to be minimized. So for example, on agricultural implements, they get some implements. There's no doubt about it. They ship implements, plows and equipment out from Eastern Canada. But the training they get is very, very poor. In fact, some of the trainers don't know anything about farming themselves. Their singular qualification for teaching the Indigenous people how to farm is that they're white. A lot of them were even farmers, so they didn't have any more knowledge about agriculture than the Indigenous people did. A lot of the implements that get sent out are very poor quality, and that's not surprising. Governments usually buy on a tender system where companies bid to supply these kinds of products. And of course, it's always the cheapest bid that gets the contract. And oftentimes that means it's just poor quality goods. So often the seed that arrives in Western Canada, often the quality of the implements that arise in Western Canada for the Indigenous people is just poor quality. So let's turn for a final point here to the treaty's current legal standing. I'm just going to look at one case here, but it's useful because it excuse me, gets at some of the basic questions of rights attached to traditional livelihoods for the Indigenous people in the prairies. I'm going to look at the case Rex versus Sundown in the Supreme Court in 1996. A man named by the name of John Sundown was charged with illegally cutting down trees and building a log cabin in a provincial park. Now, that is illegal. If I walk into a provincial park and cut down some trees and build a small little structure for myself, that's illegal. There's probably a permit available or something like that I might be able to do that, but just to do that's not legal. Sundown maintained that he had a right to hunt on Crown lands under the terms of Treaty 6. And there's no doubt about it. Treaty 6 does say on lands that are not passed out to other settlers as private property, in other words, land that remains in the title of the Crown land, that Indigenous people would be able to continue to hunt. And that's those sentences earlier that we were looking at, that they would not interfere with their right to hunt and fish. Well, that's what he's claiming here. He's saying that the provincial park is Crown land. Treaty 6 says I can hunt on Crown land. But then he extends it, and this is where it becomes interesting. He extends it and says that the cabin that he built, where he cut down the trees and built a small cabin for himself, was part of the traditional method of hunting. This is the part that the provincial government disputed, and this is what they wanted him charged with. They wanted him charged not with the hunting offense. We've seen other hunting offenses in other treaty cases. They wanted him charged for having cut down the trees and built this cabin. They argued that the treaty right, and look at this, this is a kind of thing we've seen in other instances in the course, that the treaty right to hunt did not extend to these additional practices. So they're saying if you look at the treaty, it just says you can hunt. It doesn't say you can go into the land and cut down trees and build things. It says you can hunt. But what Sundown is arguing is that I can't just hunt. I have to hunt in my traditional manner. And what he argues is that the way indigenous people in the prairies hunted in the past was by setting up a camp at the beginning of a period and then in effect going off on a series of journeys and always returning to the camp. So they would start at the camp, walk out into the woods or the forest or into the plains or wherever they were, go hunting. They might be a day, they might be 2 days. They would hunt. They would bring their capture back to the camp. They would gut it, clean it, perhaps dry it or smoke it or begin to preserve it in some kind of fashion, eat some of it. And then they would go off again, but they would go off often in a different direction. And they would do that for 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, till they had accumulated a sufficient quantity of meat to bring back to the village. And that was usually meant to be a kind of, a store for the winter for the village. And he argues that's the traditional way of hunting. So the only way I can hunt, I don't just kind of walk out into the woods and kill something and drag it back home. This is the way we do it. This is the traditional method. The provincial court agreed with the province that the treaty did not actually give him the right to do all of this stuff. The Supreme Court, however, sided with Sundown. The Supreme Court ruled that the cabin was reasonably related. And this is kind of legal terminology. In other words, and the terminology is getting at what a reasonable person would think would be connected to something. So it's reasonably related to the hunt. The argument is that this method of hunting is not only traditional, but appropriate, and the shelter is an important component of it. In other words, remember last week when we were looking at the Douglas Treaties, we saw that Saanich band who petitioned against the attempt to block off a bay where they engaged in a fishery. And they went to the province and said, they're blocking our fishery. And the province argued, no, the treaty just says you can fish. It doesn't say where you can fish or how you fish or anything. It just says you can fish. You can fish in the next bay. And the Saanich people argue, no, the fishery is the fishery that we've always fished in. That bay is the bay that we fish in. We have fished in that bay for millennia. This has always been where we are. And again, the Supreme Court agreed with them there. That there wasn't just a legal right in the abstract to fish, it was a legal abstract to continue their traditional ways. Fishing was part of that, and that location was part of that. So they had to have access to that bay. This is the same kind of argument, that it's not just a technical right or a literal right to have a hunt, but it's to have the broader set of practices attached to that also protected. Treaty rights must also include the other activities that a right holder has to exercise that right. Sorry, another typo there. And quote, the right protected in a treaty must extend beyond the literal words of the treaty terms. Beyond the literal words. And again, we've seen that in a number, from the Marshall Treaties in Nova Scotia, through the Upper Canada Treaties in Rice Lake, through the Robinson Treaties in Northern Ontario, and here again on the prairies a century after the Marshall a century after the Marshall Treaties. We're seeing the same idea being applied by the courts in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. They're looking at this and saying, if we read this in this really narrow, literal fashion, it's really not a very useful right. There's really nothing practical or pragmatic that you can use there. We need to see it as a broader set of practices. And that is something that's probably worth protecting. If we are to say, as we say in our Constitution, if we are to protect treaty rights and give acknowledgement to treaty rights, then we need to attach ourselves, or protect as well, the broader set of practices attached to that right. And that's where this is one really interesting case. I want to stop there. I'm going to end with Poundmaker, one of the chief negotiators for Treaty 6 in 1876. Poundmaker is an important and impressive leader of the Cree people in the period leading up to the Red River Rebellion in 1885. But he's also an incredibly articulate spokesperson and a forceful diplomat for getting Indigenous positions heard and somehow worked into the title. And I would suggest to you that many of the Indigenous leaders of today are following in Poundmaker's shoes by trying to articulate and demonstrate the importance of these ways and finding legal means to have them recognized by the Canadian government and more broadly by the Canadian society. And I think that's really part of what we're talking about in this course, really one of the challenges that we face in this course. That we need to be talking about these issues, and we need to be thinking about them in broader terms than what we literally see in the treaty by the bare text that we're presented with. When we look at the history, when we look at the context, we see there's something richer there than the limited words of the treaties often allow us. And it's only by kind of pushing that envelope, pushing that kind of argumentative position into new ground, into new ideas, to new ways of thinking about things, that this becomes possible. But it also has to stem from a spirit of negotiation, and as we've been saying in this country for the past number of years, a spirit of reconciliation, that we can come together and find, again, common ground that can allow us to move forward into the future. Take care. Don't know when I'll next see you again, but we'll probably be talking online in forums in the next few weeks. Take care and be well.